Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Swati, platform moderator for Web Platform for Dialogue, and it's a great opportunity to have Dr. Sarah. She's an intellectual historian and contemporary Islam. She's an associate professor of modern Islam at Fordham University in New York City, US. Her work focuses on the mainly contemporary Islam and Islamic law, especially in the context of post-coloniality and authoritarianism. Her work so far has concentrated on Nigeria and Egypt. Dr. Sarah, in her wonderful book, Sharia on Trial, Northern Nigeria's Islamic Revolution, University of California Press, has been published in the year 2017. So it examined why Northern Nigerians took to the stress in the starting of 1990s to demand the re-implementation of Sharia law. I'm really overwhelmed with her response for accepting as a webinar speaker for today's discussion. And that's a great opportunity to hear you, Dr. Sarah, for this particular webinar series in the month of July for Web Platform for Dialogue. Now I'm handing over the session to Dr. Sarah for her talk, and after finishing her talk, we will definitely get back to the participants who have been presented today for the question answer. Sarah, it's your floor now.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. I am very honored by this invitation, and you introduced my area of expertise, which I'm not going to talk about at all today, unless you ask me. And instead, I'm going to talk about my observations of COVID-19 in the United States and the way that it has affected us, and comment on some of the factors. I would imagine that most of the audience watching are based in India. I don't know if that's correct. Probably.
Most of them, but some of them are from US too, and from Sri Lanka also we have.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So I would imagine that you have many questions about how things are being handled here, why it looks the way that it does. So I'm excited to get to the question and answer, because I would like to hear from your perspective what you're seeing. I'm sure it's very sobering. So I will just offer a few observations, and then we can open it up. So, of course, the pandemic struck us here in the United States that's an open question. We don't know exactly when the infections started coming to the United States. Everything now is a point of debate. But I think it's important to start with a little bit of the backstory, which is, the overall theme here is why, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but I think there's no way to describe the way that this has been handled in the United States except to call it a disaster. And so we need to analyze why it has been this way. And one of the places we can start is to look at what happened before the pandemic actually struck. So as of course you know, President Trump was elected in 2016. By 2017, the Pandemic Response Unit of the National Security Council had been basically gutted. It went from about 250 employees to about 100 employees, and it lost the majority of its funding. So whatever bureaucratic setup we had in the United States to actually be able to get in front of a pandemic before it started was dismantled before the pandemic actually started. So this is the first issue. So I have a quote here from Beth Cameron, who was the director of the Pandemic Response Unit, and she wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post saying that the directorate was set up to be a smoke alarm to get ahead of emergencies and sound a warning at the earliest sound of fire, with the goal of avoiding a 6-alarm fire. However, because it has been dismantled, this is, in her opinion, the main explanation of the sluggish domestic response. So basically, we were caught completely unaware. Now, President Trump, for his part, when he was asked, you know, why did you dismantle this pandemic response team? He was asked this at a press conference, and he replied that it was a nasty question. And he said, quote, "I don't know anything about it." So he then said, this is something that you can never really think is going to happen, which scientifically speaking is not true, right? We know that pandemics happen about once a century, and actually you do know that it's going to happen, which is why you had this team set up. So I think that this was one of, in addition to kind of pointing out why there wasn't a bureaucratic ability to respond, it also marks the first moment that the whole situation became so politicized in the United States. And I'm just curious, I usually travel a lot, and especially in the summer, but of course I haven't done that this year. So I'm curious to hear, you know, if it's been politicized in your parts of the world to the degree that it has been politicized here. It's hard to believe that something like a pandemic, like a virus, could be politicized, but it has been to a huge degree here in the United States. So I'm just curious about the comparative perspective with you. But to start there, John Bolton at the time, you know, you may have heard that he was Trump's former national security advisor. He was fired, and now he's got a best-selling book out. And at the time when he was asked, okay, well, why did you dismantle the pandemic response, he called it an angry left-wing question. Okay, so again, this sets the stage for the politicization of the conflict. So I'll give you a little bit just of my perspective too. Of course, I'm in academia, I'm a professor, and in the business of academia, if you will, you know, our struggle here in the United States is that the public education system, and I'm not exactly sure how it is in your part of the world, but the public education system is funded usually by the state, right? And so that's, of course, we have many private schools, but the bread and butter higher education system in the United States, which most people can afford, let's say if you're a resident of the state of New York and you want to go to the City University of New York, that would, as a resident of New York, that would be very affordable, and you should be able to get a good education. Why is it affordable? Because the state of New York devotes, you know, a certain amount of money to the university. Well, what's been happening over the last 20 years or so is that the states have decreased more and more and more the amount that they give to education, and educational institutions have been therefore dependent more and more on tuition dollars, right? So many schools, private schools operate like this 100%, but now it's to the point where even public schools will shut down without students. We don't have guaranteed funding from the state. So the immediate concern in higher education was, okay, we have a pandemic, we can't go outside, we can't really have classes, so what is going to happen to higher education? If we don't go to our universities and conduct our classes, then we will shut down. And if we shut down, we will, you know, the idea is that we will never open up again, because higher education is under various forms of assault in the United States today. There are many people who don't agree with what they believe is taught at universities. And so it became this ideological issue. Now, how is it that not only, I'm speaking about education because that's my field, but this is true of all businesses, right? And all sectors, and including small businesses, which I'll get to in a moment. If you want to keep your businesses open, if you want to have any kind of semblance of real life, you need to have some kind of national response that will help people get back to work. So in the US, at first, we were watching South Korea, we were watching Germany, and we were saying, okay, they figured out how to do this. You take temperatures, you contact trace, you test people, and you know there's a way to mitigate this virus. We were very, very shocked to discover in the United States that the national government really had no intention of doing any of this, right? So there is no national strategy. I mean, I can't sugarcoat it. There's just no national strategy. There's no funding to the states there is no coordinated national strategy to combat the virus. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. There has been, up until very recently, essentially a campaign to deny that the virus is serious, to deny that it's anything other than a cold. And so it has been disastrously politicized. And so the irony from the point of view, so let's say you are Trump and the Republicans and you want to get reelected this November. The way to get reelected, the conventional wisdom goes, is make sure you have a strong economy. How do you have a strong economy? Keep the businesses open. How do you keep the businesses open? Have a coordinated national response to the pandemic so that we don't all get sick and flood the hospitals and have to close. So even from the point of view of their own political interests, it's not making a lot of sense to people why there isn't a national strategy. Okay. So as you probably know, the state of New York was hit the hardest at the beginning of the pandemic. Over 28,000 people died just in the state of New York. I am here and now, and I can tell you that it feels like it's not the same city that it used to be. It feels like almost like coming out of a war zone or a kind of a post-apocalyptic environment. You know, of course, it's mandatory 100% mask wearing because we have a governor who mandates this. So now in the United States, the pandemic, the way the pandemic is handled is 100% dependent on your governor of your state. So because Governor Cuomo has been pretty proactive about the virus the whole time, there is a national mask mandate and you know, a very careful reopening process. But it does feel that people are shell-shocked and kind of scared. The restaurants are still empty and nobody knows quite what they're doing. But on the positive side, the infection rate has gone way down. And, you know, people, you know, it's not as terrifying of a situation. But when it was really bad in New York a few months ago, we saw what would emerge as a kind of competition between the governors and the federal government. So Governor Cuomo was begging the federal government to please send ventilators, for example, to New York. And famously, Jared Kushner, who is President Trump's son-in-law, said, "These are our ventilators in the national stockpile. We're not giving those to New York." So it really set up this dynamic of an impression that the federal government was one entity and the states were another. And that's not how the United States system works. The federal government is supposed to be the coordinating body of all of the states. So I'll kind of switch topics now. Another dynamic that has really emerged after COVID is that it has become clear, you know, we made an assumption that we are a society that is ruled in some ways by a respect for science and objectivity and the scientific method. And it has become clear that unless you as a society continuously emphasize that the scientific method is important, that rational thinking is important, that listening to experts is important, unless you continuously reinforce that message, I have been really surprised by the speed with which conspiracy theories and non-scientific thinking can really take over huge amounts of the population. It really feels as if the hold on rational thinking and scientific thinking is very delicate, and that one can never kind of lose perspective on, one can never really relax about that. You must always kind of reinforce it. And there's a few reasons why there has been such a huge proliferation here of conspiracy theories and very different ideas about how to mitigate the virus. I can speak to this personally because about a month ago, I drove my car from Los Angeles, which is in the West Coast, southern West Coast of the United States, all the way to New York, which is on the top of the East Coast. And this took, I did that because it was dangerous to fly and a lot of other reasons. This took me over a week. And so I was able to visit different parts of the country. Most of the places I visited were more conservative areas, more Republican-leaning areas, and more Trump-supporting areas. Los Angeles and New York are not such areas, okay? But the places in between are places that I visited, and I spoke to a lot of people and got their impressions. So before I get to those stories, I'll just say that we have had major confusion over, first of all, what the virus is and how to mitigate the virus. And it has also really struck me, it seems like an obvious point, but you don't really understand it until a crisis moment. Leadership matters so, so much. If President Trump says something, there is just going to be a huge percentage of the population, whether they support him or not, that at least considers his point. So if he comes out and says, oh, it's just a cold, and you'll recover from it in a few days, which is not scientifically viable if you look at what's been happening to people with the virus. But if he just kind of just says that, then you will find a huge percentage of the population that basically believes that. Therefore, if it's just a cold and you're just going to get it and you're just going to get over it in a few days, then you don't need to wear a mask. And therefore, if it's just a cold and you're going to get over it in a few days, anyone who's telling you to wear a mask, this is the logic, is trying to control you, is trying to make you a tool of the government. And so this is what I heard as I was driving across the country, that, look, this is just a cold. And in fact, some people have COVID parties where, kind of like the chicken pox, where they organize a big party full of people really close to each other, hoping that they will get the virus so they can just get it over with, okay? And this has caused major disasters in places like Alabama and Florida. Because, of course, many of us do not just simply get over no one gets over the virus in a few days, to my knowledge. If you're lucky, you have a terrible illness and maybe you'll get over it in a week or two, maybe 2 weeks minimum. But this idea that it's just the sniffles is just completely not true. Okay. So, the messaging from the federal government is one of the factors that has caused a huge amount of confusion. But on the other hand, another factor that's caused a lot of confusion is the mixed messaging from the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and even the World Health Organization, right? So these two organizations have not been consistent in their messaging. They have said, a mask is not necessary unless you are a doctor on the front lines, and now that has changed. Now, we can debate why those messages from respected institutions like this have changed, but one of the things that people often fail to appreciate is that that's also how science works, right? Science is also it's a field of discovery. I mean, you have to use your brain to come up with scientific innovations and explanations. And so it's based on, actually, that's what the scientific method is. It's based on experimentation. You experiment and experiment and experiment, and if, let's say you try the same thing 10 times, it's all about repetition. If you try the same thing 10 times and it works the same way all 10 times, that's how you know that your hypothesis is correct. So the scientific method itself is a process. So if we knew that, then it would be less surprising when the CDC or the WHO revises their recommendations. There's also politics involved, and I'll let you tell me your opinions on that. But I just wanted to put out there that there is something called scientific experimentation. Most people don't know that. So ironically, even though there has been a real reduction in the trust of scientists, there's also this idea that scientists should be telling the objective truth 100% of the time as if it's coming down from heaven, and it should never change. And that's actually not even the way the scientific method works. But aside from this, we just also live in the United States, especially, there's a saying we have here that we're now living in a post-fact society. And this started even, on Trump's very first day of office with his inauguration. In the United States, as you probably know, you're elected in November, and then on January 20th, you have a big parade and you have an inauguration in Washington, D.C. Well, his inauguration didn't have a lot of people there, unlike Obama's inauguration, which was very full, right? His had fewer people. But from day one, even though we have video footage and we have the aerial helicopters that can tell you how many people approximately were there, from day one, his press secretary and he himself said, it was full. This is the biggest inauguration in history. And so the media pushed back and said, well, no, it's not the biggest inauguration in history. We have this video footage. And then he came back with his press secretary who said, well, we have, quote, alternative facts. Okay. And that really set the stage for what we're calling the post-fact society, that there's no such thing as a fact. We can all have our own facts. Okay. This is really a disaster. Right? If we can't agree on something basic like how many people were at an inauguration, then we can't have a functioning society where something is the truth and something is false. And when the media, who's supposed to act as, the founding fathers of the United States, explicitly mentioned the media as the body that could proof text, that could check the facts, of what the government is saying. And when you have the government systematically saying the media is lying, fake news, then of course you start to chip away at the one of the only mechanisms we have to ascertain whether something is fact or fiction. So this has also really come back to bite us in the age of the pandemic. We can't get an agreed upon idea of what is a fact. We can't get all Americans to agree that this is a virus that has, that is dangerous and that we need masks, etc. Because we have been set up not to trust the media and not to even trust the scientific method and not to trust facts. You may have heard of our top infectious disease expert here in the United States named Dr. Anthony Fauci. And he used to do these press conferences with Trump every day. And, Dr. Fauci, in my opinion, has done a very admirable job of really trying to stick to the facts in a political context that is very tough. I mean, he's trying to say some things about the virus, and then you have President Trump coming on right after him saying exactly the opposite, and he needs to keep his composure or he'll be fired, and all of us are just praying that this man doesn't get fired. And so they were having press conferences every day in which this dynamic was taking place. Well, one day in April, President Trump said something, you probably heard about this, about injecting bleach as a way of fighting off the virus. This did not go over well with many people, and it was widely made fun of. And so what he did was he walked off the stage, and then he stopped doing pandemic briefings at all. And then he seemed to change his policy to saying, okay, that's it. I'm going to pretend that this doesn't exist at all. And that's when the government, or he, started planning rallies and never wearing a mask and making a big show of never wearing a mask. Now, Dr. Fauci actually has come out recently and talked about the amount of harassment and death threats that he is getting simply for stating the facts of what's going on with the pandemic. As you may know, Dr. Fauci became a world-famous scientist because of his research on HIV/AIDS. And when he was doing research on HIV/AIDS, you know, he said in a recent interview, yes, he would get hate mail, especially from homophobic people who said, why are you bothering with these people? You know, and so, yeah, he would get, of course, some hate mail. But he said what he's experiencing now is like nothing he could ever have imagined. He said, it's tough. There are serious threats being made against me, my wife, against my daughters. He said, I can't believe this is the United States of America. He's been given 24-hour security. And this is because he's getting up and saying there's a virus. He said, quote, I don't see how people can have animosity to that. I understand you have to be careful because of the negative consequences of shutting down. That's understandable, which is why we are all trying to open up America again in a way that is safe, that we can do in a measured fashion. But the hostility against public health issues is difficult, not only to understand, but difficult to process. Now, I will say that I'm going to turn now to the economic situation. I will say that, you know, I mentioned I drove through the United States. And, you know, you do have this phenomena of middle-class families who are, let's say, barely making it. Like maybe they own a restaurant, okay? And the profit that they make from their restaurant barely pays for their children's educations and their life and their, let's say, their mortgage on their house. Also, as you may know, in the United States, the way health insurance is set up, we very famously do not have national health insurance. The way you get insurance is if you're middle class. So here's how it works. If you're middle class, the way you get insurance is through your employer. You have an employer, so that means you have to have a job to have insurance. If you are very poor, meaning below the poverty line, you can get a state or a state insurance. It doesn't have a lot of benefits, but below the poverty line in the United States is really poor. I mean, it's hard. I think there have been studies recently that show that if you're below the poverty line, or even if you have a minimum wage job, there is not a single city, not one city in the United States where you can afford to pay a month of rent on a minimum wage job. So, and then of course, if you're ultra wealthy, you can buy whatever insurance you want and it's not a problem for you. But for the middle class, which is the vast majority of people, you have to have a job. Well, if you're shutting down all, you know, human society and not allowing people to go to work, then you don't have insurance, which is a big problem in the middle of a health pandemic. Okay. So you have these people who you can understand their position in these places I drove through, where they're saying, hey, the government is telling us to shut down our businesses. And they're telling us not to go to work. They're telling us to shut down our hair salon and our nail salon. And by the way, a lot of the people who have small businesses are minorities, okay? So nail salons are overwhelmingly people from Southeast Asia, like Vietnamese or Filipino, or from people, okay? Place where you get your eyebrows done and hair, it's overwhelmingly Indian, right? And it's mostly women, right? So you know, I feel terrible that, like, I know that my, you know, dear woman who does my eyebrows, she is struggling very much in her business, right? And how is she going to feed her family? Okay, so that's understandable. Hair salons. So a lot of these people actually are minorities that have small businesses. And so they're saying, how are we supposed to do this? We don't have insurance. And you're telling us that people are not allowed to come into our stores. What do we do? And now, of course, there's also a lot of white people, Republican voters, who feel the same way. Now, I will say that because President Trump has very explicitly used race, he has always is talking about race. He's always sending subtle or unsubtle kind of messages that he is the president basically for the white population. So even those minority groups who might actually be economically sympathetic maybe to Trump and to the Republicans, they don't want to pay a lot of taxes, and they don't, you know, maybe they sympathize with some of the ideas of the Republicans, but they actually can't support them because they're too racist, right? They're like attacking them. Like, you can't support someone who's saying, you don't belong here, go home, right? And so he's saying this to all kinds of people. So So you can understand, you know, when I was in, let's say, for example, South Dakota, which is one of the whitest states in the United States, and I went into a restaurant and not one person was, first of all, it's possible to walk into a restaurant where everyone is eating at tables like nothing is happening, no masks whatsoever. And I went in there because I just needed to get some food. And it's interesting how it works. I did wear a mask when I walked in, but you can immediately tell that you're making everybody else uncomfortable, right, in the room. And so, you know, just human nature, you don't want to make all these people uncomfortable. So I took off my mask and I start talking to, it's owned by a family, and I started talking to them and saying, you know, so why aren't you wearing a mask and what's going on? And they were very nice, but they said, you know, hun, this is the government trying to control us. I refuse to live in fear. And what am I supposed to do? Shut down my restaurant and starve? What can I do? That's very understandable. What I don't understand about it is why not, see what they do then is they place the blame on the scientists. They place the blame on the public health officials. They place the blame on the people telling them there's a virus. They don't place the blame on the government who could be giving them money every month or helping their business. In Canada, I mean, it's unbelievable. In Canada, I think they give each Canadian citizen something like $1,200 a month. End of story. You know, they're not having this big disaster. Here, you've got the Republicans wanting to cut it from $600 to $200. So my question that, you know, many political scientists ask and they don't have an answer to is, why don't these middle class or lower middle class white business owning populations blame the government for not helping them? Why do they blame the scientists and the liberals and the educated people? We don't understand this. You know, no one understands this. Okay. Now, continuing with the economic situation. The government then said, okay, we're going to help small businesses with these small business loans. So the idea was, if you have a small business, we're going to give you a loan and we're going to forgive 60% of that loan as long as you keep your employees employed. Okay? So this was their idea for keeping the economy up without, they don't want to give people quote unquote handouts. Okay, now, like Canada does, because they're socialists and communists, okay? Anyway, so, okay, fine, you give people these loans, but here's the problem. If you're running a nail salon or a eyebrow place or a restaurant, you don't need your employees because there's no customers, okay? So you could have, if they had given people more flexibility, like let's say you can take that money and pay your mortgage to your lease, which is what people are struggling with. Or you can take that money and invest it in a different way. Maybe that would have been more helpful. But no, the rules were you only get the 60% forgiven if you keep people on your payroll. Well, people are complaining, we don't have work for them. So what do we do, right? And then what this is doing is it's leaving people in the situation where maybe they take out a loan and then maybe a big loan, and then maybe they can't meet these criteria of keeping people on the payroll. So what happens? After the pandemic, not only are they out of business, but now they owe, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans that they have to pay back 100%. And nobody knows what the interest rate is. Nobody knows the details. There were huge problems with this funding. The people who benefited the most were two groups: the banks and big businesses and people with ties to the Trump administration. So the banks themselves made $10 billion in fees just right away. So the banks really benefited from this. And then the Treasury Department left it up to the banks to determine how to hand out the loans. So the banks were making it purposely confusing, right? They were setting up websites and the websites would crash. They weren't giving people details. You could call a hotline to get the loans, and then the banks were saying, I'm sorry, we don't have information right now, call us back later. They were making it very hard to get the loans. much of the money went to thriving and not struggling companies. So, for example, it's supposed to be for businesses that have a maximum of 30 employees. But here's what a lot of businesses did. So McDonald's, okay, McDonald's is not a small business, as we all know. However, each individual McDonald's franchise, the McDonald's which is across the street from me, sure, that one has 30 employees. So what happens is that all 10 million McDonald's applied for the loan, okay, and do you see what I mean? And got the majority of the money, saying, okay, well, we're just funding our franchise. So this is how a lot of big businesses got the loans. There are also, I'll tell you some other people who got huge amounts of money. So have you heard of Kanye West, a big rap star here, a billionaire here in the United States? He's actually running for president now, which is another disaster. In any case, he got, let's see, a huge amount in loans. We had other rock stars who are already millionaires who got loans. We've got probably one of the richest artists alive. His name is Jeff Koons. He got $1 to $2 million in loans. We don't know exactly why, but we do know that the Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin, his father, had recently purchased a $91 million painting from Jeff Koons, and he happened to get this money. Private member club called the Soho House in New York got $2 billion in loans. The restaurant chains that I told you about had $1 million in loans. Another big scandal here is religious institutions getting huge amounts in loans. The Catholic Church got $2 billion in loans. The Church of Scientology got, let's see, I don't have the exact, no, between 5 to 10 million in loans. Various Jewish organizations got millions of dollars in loans. Here in the United States, religious institutions do not pay taxes, right? They're tax-free. They are not the people meant to get these loans. The Ayn Rand Institute, which is a very conservative group that does not believe actually in government at all and does not believe in any welfare whatsoever. That's their actual philosophy. They got $2 billion in loans. Paul Pelosi, Nancy, so then the corruption is on both sides. On the Democratic side, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. You may have heard of her. Her husband, Paul Pelosi, got $350,000 to $1 million in loans for his small business. The wife of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, she got $2 million in loans. So this is, and President Trump keeps firing the the people who would be empowered to do an ethical investigation, the investigator, what we call independent investigators. Trump just keeps firing them, just one after the other. And it's a disaster because Congress just seems to be incapable of holding him accountable. Okay, I'm almost finished. The other thing I'll comment on is the coronavirus and minorities, because one of the other theories of, well, why is it that there isn't more of a national strategy to deal with the coronavirus? One of the theories is that it's really the minority populations and poorer people who are getting hit with the virus the most hard, and therefore the government, which is a very explicitly, I'm going to just say it, it's a racist government. It is, you know, I think there's a lot of evidence. I'd be happy to give you some. And a government that's very, very concerned with tax cuts for the wealthy mostly. They actually kind of just don't care about those populations. And that's one theory as to why there isn't more of a national response. So the question is, why should a virus affect especially African-American populations and Latino populations so dramatically much harder than the majority population? So there's some theories about that. So African-Americans actually make up, for example, in Wisconsin, 70% of the deaths from coronavirus. Okay, so, but it's only 25% of the state's population. Why? Well, so there are a few factors. Also, Native Americans have been hit even harder than African Americans. So the question is why? So there's social and economic factors. The first one is living in crowded housing conditions. Okay, so if you have 10 people living in a 3-room apartment, you cannot social distance. If someone among those 10 people, of course, has to go out and work or get food, they might contract the virus and then come back and infect all of the 10 people in their house. So this is one of the reasons, the crowded living conditions. The other is that those populations overwhelmingly work in what we call essential services. So those are the people who drive the buses, who do the trash pickup, who operate the subways, and who are doing janitorial work. So all of the jobs where, even though people with more privilege, we got to stay home during the pandemic. And this is one of the reasons I was advocating that professors should wear a mask and go back into the classroom to the extent possible, because I think it's important to save higher education, but also because it's unfair to the essential workers who we're not even considering letting the mailman stay home or the UPS delivery or the person driving the bus. We just let them work, right, without even saying a word. So there's so many different problems here. And then the last factor is the underlying health conditions. Because they don't have good health insurance, they have untreated heart conditions, untreated autoimmune disorders compromising the immune system, untreated diabetes is another big problem. And so this is why those communities are disproportionately affected. So I'll just end with a few observations. One of the things that has happened since the pandemic started is you may have heard about the really big Black Lives Matter protests and the big racial protests that are happening here in the United States, which are huge in scale. We haven't seen anything like it since the 1960s, and people report that this is even bigger than that. And a lot of people actually attribute the fact that we were able to have those kinds of protests in some ways to the pandemic, because we're less distracted. This, to me, I'm not a sports fan, but maybe some of you are. People point to, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that this has such influence, but the fact that there's no sports to distract people, means that people have more time, I guess, to tune into political and social issues like police brutality against African Americans. And also, it's just become the pandemic has made it very clear what the problems are in our society in the United States and in the world at large. We really now face a choice between leaders who are going to put their head in the sand and run their countries as if it's like their personal fiefdom, just enriching themselves and their immediate clan, or you have leaders that have a broader outlook, who care about the environment, who understand that factory farming, for example, the way we treat animals, the way we treat the environment, all of this is not just like a hobby. This is actually going to form the future as to whether or not we can live in a safe planet at this point. So, and then the last factor is we understand now that we need to cultivate a more communal spirit. Here in the United States, there's all this mythology about individuals. We are a society of individuals. Every single person gets to decide for themselves how to live their life. Well, that doesn't work very well. Pandemic is communal. So if you're not willing to wear a mask to save me, then we have a serious problem. And we have many people who say, we literally have people who just say, I don't care if you die. I'm not wearing a mask. It's more important to me not to wear a mask and to preserve my freedom and individuality than to protect you. So this is a crisis of more philosophical, spiritual crisis that really needs some kind of reckoning. A lot rides here in the United States on what happens in November. We're very concerned about the upcoming election. We're concerned that we're even going to have an election. We're concerned that it will be a fair election. And so you know, please wish us well that we at least have a fair election. And so I will end there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. And actually, while listening you, I'm just capitulating my mind that it's the exact scenario what's happening in India too. So
okay.
I think we should have a comparative research paper on India US. I think India is just copy pasting the friend of US, and scenario it's almost similar in each and every sector. So apart
Really?
from that, we have a round of question. Maybe time constraint, we may not have to answer all the questions, but I really would like to have addressed Jyotirmoy Chakraborty's question. Do you think the intensity of infection and its spread is severe in US because of the negligence, underestimating, and moreover stupidity of Trump government? Do you think so?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, you know,
yes, the question.
There's no other explanation. I mean, why are people going to bars?
Yes, leadership is a bigger you know, kind of issues in terms of this particular pandemic spreading up in India too. I totally agreed.
If Trump had worn a mask from the beginning and supported the governors and said, hey, we're in a national crisis, like New Zealand did, like Germany did, like smart people did, we wouldn't have all of these people who are denying that there's a virus. This costs hundreds of thousands of lives. It's not funny, you know. It's not a joke.
And there is a small update from India that today we are the top in the COVID virus. Yes.
Really? I didn't know that. You have the most. What do you mean by top? You have the most infection rates?
Yes, most infection rate.
Wow. And why is that in India?
The same scenario because of dealing with the situation has been worst after the community transmission have been started already, and we don't know that how it could be transmitted, and the scenario has been getting worse while the domestic helpers and the others, the migrants, they are traveling from their existing city to their hometown. The scenario has been worst right now. So we really don't know that what will happen actually. So the next question is, what will be your comment about US and WHO debate on this pandemic issue on the basis of the allegations made by him regarding suspecting information on behalf of China? Yes, Trump, you know, pointed out it's a China virus. So what would be your comment?
Everything Trump does is political, and everything he does is political. I'm not saying the WHO is perfect. I'm not saying, you know, the idea is that they were kind of easy on China so that they would be able to work with China. All of that is debatable, but you know, you look at the timing of when Trump withdrew, you know, with all this fanfare, withdrew funding from the WHO. He did that to cover up the fact that the infection rate here is mushrooming. So, of course, I believe that we should be working with the WHO and that everyone makes mistakes, and maybe there is a little bit of corruption in politics. Please tell me somewhere where there isn't corruption in politics. But to the extent of as if we have a better strategy than the WHO, like we don't need the WHO, our infection rates are so low here that we don't need any international assistance. We need this. You want to call it the China virus? We need China's help. Okay? If China develops a vaccine, we're going to need that vaccine. We need international cooperation. You know, so it doesn't make sense.
Wonderful. And we have another question from Dr. Aniruddha Burman. According to the Atlantic, the coronavirus didn't break America. It revealed what was already broken. How do you react on this?
I agree, very much so. I really agree with that. I do think that the Trump administration is more corrupt objectively than average, but it has really revealed how deep the racial problems are. when you just see that 70% of the deaths are African Americans, you have to stand back and ask yourself, for 11% of the population, you just right there, you have to really think about that. That racism is not a, you know, has life and death consequences. And yes, I think it does. I just completely agree with that. What has shown to me, I mean, I guess as I mentioned, the most surprising factors is it shows, I didn't really realize the degree of the cronyism in the government. The fact that you could have 300 billion dedicated to saving small businesses, and the majority of that would be taken by the spouses of congresspeople, the family of the government. You know, here in the US, they're always talking about corrupt, authoritarian, third world countries, and they always describe them in those terms. Oh, well, they give their money. Huh, they just buy. That's exactly what's happening here. So I didn't know that. I didn't know it was that bad. I'll say that. Yeah.
Corruption is everywhere. We can't ignore it, because whether it's third world, first world, whatever world, corruption, you know, everywhere. So the next question is, COVID brought to the world how difficult the medical condition of an advanced nation like America also. So what do you think about it, that how they, you know, because we always exemplify American people, you know, they are the just God to us kind of thing. So, you know, when COVID situation has been coming up, you know, how the American people are actually dealing with that could be another, you know, another story of another black story actually. So what is your opinion that the medical facility about, how would you react on this?
Is the question, you know, how do I react to what this reflects about American society?
Yes. Yeah. A kind of a reflection. Yes, kind of a reflection.
Again, it is very surprising to me that I didn't know, you know, we are taught, I was born here in America. And so we are taught from elementary school that this is a country of freedom, and the idea of freedom is tied to individuality. So I can be whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to, I have to be respectful to my neighbors, but I don't have to help my neighbors. You know, the idea is everything is kind of your fault. If you're poor, it's your fault. If you are struggling, it's your fault, because it's a land of opportunity. So if you don't succeed, it's because you didn't take the opportunity. And I think I think a lot of people really hold on. The interesting thing is that the people who hold on to that mythology the most are the people who need the most help. So those are the people who actually would really benefit from national health care. Those are the people who could really use $2,000 a month from the government. But those are the same people who are saying, no, I don't want a government handout. I'm an individual. I don't want to care about what other people are doing. And so it's like ego, you know, or a form of pride. Because another thing I've realized, and that I think many of us have realized, is that the biggest recipients of welfare are the rich. I mean, they just get money thrown at them. I mean, the more money you have, the more money people give you for free. It's quite amazing. And they get all kinds of government handouts and tax cuts that they don't need, and bonuses that they don't need. And, you know, the road is paved for them. So it's not like the mythology has really been exposed as very flawed. And we don't seem to have, although there are a lot of really nice and wonderful people, we don't seem to have a collective national idea that we are one community that needs to help each other. We're very divided on the basis, especially of race and class.
So much, Sarah. And here I really would like to address a wonderful decision that has been taken by MIT and Harvard also, other university in US, to stand with the student. And they have taken the right decision to support the student at the right moment. that I think Trump haven't taken the decision that who haven't doing the regular classes by attending their campus, they should not be there with their student visa. They have to return back to their home country.
Right.
That was a tremendously, a wonderful decision have been taken by MIT and other institutions.
And Harvard. Well,
I really appreciate. I really appreciate because I'm not sure that whether the same situation will be in India. I don't know if the institution would be taken that kind of firm decision to stand by the students. So I really hats off. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And we are almost at the end of our discussions. Unfortunately, we may not have any other question for Sarah. I really would like to have a concluding remark that what would be the scenario you can predict after 5 years right now? Because the election is upcoming, what would be your foresight, I would like to say, futuristic approach after COVID scenario, how US will be back in the position?
Well, we're in a very tough situation here because those of us who really want real foundational change, many of us do not believe that many of the people who want real change do not support Trump. That's probably a given. But also many people don't see that in Biden and in the kind of Democratic establishment. So those of us who wanted really deep change, we tended to support other candidates, but now it's coalesced around Biden. And of course, now we believe that Trump is an absolute national emergency. And if he doesn't leave after November, then the United States will really forever be lost as any hope. So of course we, most people who want change, who don't like what's happening now, we want Biden to win the election. We very much hope there is an election because obviously, Trump is trying to now set the stage from now to say that the election was rigged. If you look on his Twitter every day, there's a tweet about how mail-in voting is, because, obviously because of the pandemic, we want to mail in our vote. We don't want to go stand in line like this with people to vote. And so he's already tweeting every day about how mail-in voting is corrupt and it's going to rig the election. So he's obviously setting this up to contest the results because well, I don't want to say anything, but the polls as of now are not looking good for him, but you never know. So let's say that, so if Trump wins, it's going to be a very difficult scenario. If Biden wins, we the opposition, are going to need to find a way to not let the Democrats continue with business as usual, because in many ways they are benefiting. It's really one club, and they're really benefiting just as much from this corruption as the Republicans, which is why they can't stop Trump. I mean, you have to ask yourself, why is he allowed to fire all the independent investigators? Why is he allowed to do all of these things that are really against the Constitution, against the law? Because the people who are supposed to be holding him accountable are also benefiting. So we would have a lot of work to do to change the character of the Democratic Party, to really start to address these really foundational problems of especially economic inequality. I mean, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, made $14 billion in one day, 2 days ago. I mean, he is on record as saying he does not know what to do with his money. He doesn't know. He wants to go to space and colonize the moon. I'm not joking, because he doesn't, of course, I don't know why he doesn't solve world hunger and such, but that's another story. So is that fair? I mean, we have some really basic questions to ask about economic inequality, while some people can't even get 2 meals to eat a day. So, and we have huge homelessness. Anyway, so I hope Biden wins and that we at least have a chance to really start to address this, and then we can use the experience of the pandemic to say, hey, we saw what was broken during this pandemic. There is another problem, which is that if and when there's a vaccine, we hope that people will take the vaccine so that we can get herd immunity, because we also have quite a big anti-vaccine movement here. I'm not sure if you have that in India, suspicion of vaccines. But we
don't have, fortunately, we don't have. We are very good, positive towards the vaccination. Whoever will be given, even from China, even from whoever.
Well, that's good. You're ahead of the United States on that one, because there are plenty of people who think that the vaccine is a chip, you know, developed by Bill Gates to control us. This is like, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's a big conspiracy theory. So there's actual genuine concern that there won't be enough people taking it to get
infected. It could be infected. Maybe if they will able to know about it, maybe some group of people in India also, they will think like that. So I'm not sure about it.
I hope you don't know about. I hope that doesn't arrive to your country. So yeah. So that's it. It'll be a struggle ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, and it's a really a great, enjoyable session with you. And I must say that we will definitely have another round of session with you regarding the minority crisis, because that's a wonderful topic that we need to address, even with the Indian context also, that how when actually it came in India at the month of February and March, how the coronavirus has been totally transferred into religious motivation, and we must have a round of session. I think that would be another session.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
So I really would like to know from your perspective that how US is thinking about the racism and the minority issues into this COVID scenario. So thank you so much for today's session. We will definitely keep in touch. And whoever is willing to keep in touch with you, please write your email address in the chat box so they can get back to you directly.
Yes, you want me to write my email in the chat box?
Yes,
sure.
Please do that.
Yeah, and so let me do that here.
And thank you so much who have been presented today and who have been with us. I think since May already we have been this web platform for dialogue, and it's a kind of a series of webinars that we are going in each and every month. And this month we are really honored to have Dr. Sarah with us. So thank you so much once again from my side.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day, because it's daytime in New York. So have a wonderful day to you.
Thank you. And good luck to you in India.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wish you all the best for US also.
Thank you.
Good wish to you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.